Hey everyone, welcome back to the Kiln. We're talking timers today, and this is one of my favorite tools that I learned from Index Card RPG. And it's simply the concept of having a dice on display counting down how many rounds are left until something happens, anything happens. Something mysterious or spooky or dread-inducing, tension-filled from the Dungeon Master. And it's a really simple tool that you can incorporate in your games, but I want to show you the different varieties as well. Between encounter timers that happen in the same scene, cross-scene timers that persist from scene to scene or encounter to encounter, and world timers that kind of span the whole session. And so as you watch these timers and these rounds go by, knowing how much time you have left, it's just something that adds a tension and an anticipation and a thrill to the scene that I absolutely love in my games. So follow me along as we talk through timers in more detail, and I hope you can use them more in your games. But for now, let's wait for the time to tick down. Now, since the timer hit 0, let's change things up and talk encounter timers. We are here on the Red Sword in the medic room, where our team is facing Gargantua, the mutant reptoid mecha, beast of the adventure. And in this particular room, we have an encounter timer, which is typically a D4. I also like to play encounter timers with a D6. And essentially, this is a timer that is applicable to this scene and this scene alone. And so having a lower dice for an encounter timer is really beneficial because you're never quite sure how long they're going to be in this room. And especially in Index Card RPG, we can change encounters pretty quickly. So having a low dice count can really help. Now, for this particular scene, I would just roll a D4, and in this many rounds, something will happen. Now, when I say something will happen, it really can be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be an increase in danger. It may be an increase in danger. It could be something that's going to change about the scene, or it could be even something about the story progresses. So don't always feel like you have to increase the danger. But like in this scene, for example, I could have a timer where in 2 rounds, some more mutant reptoids are going to hear the scuffle in the combat that's going on against the Gargantua, and they're going to show up and boost his numbers. Or in 2 rounds, he's going to let out his screech or his blast that is going to like decimate the room or whatever. Or in 2 rounds, for example, the Gargantua is going to move over here, and through the combat, he's going to, in his rage, slam into the wall, and one of the windows are going to crack. And so the story progresses a little bit, and now this room has a limited time that you're going to be in here before the airlock or the vacuum is going to kind of open up, and now there's a new danger. So it doesn't have to always be immediate, but this is a good example of an encounter timer, whether it's a D6 or a D4, having something in your room at all times ticking down really helps, especially for a GM. This really helps me because it keeps me focused so that every couple rounds something is happening, something is changing, something I'm preparing for. And again, it's not about just increasing the danger and leading to in 4 rounds your whole team is going to wipe. But no, it's just in a couple rounds it's going to change. And it keeps things fresh, whether it's controlling the pacing, adding to the intensity of it, or just moving along. Now, one thing that really comes up a lot with timers, especially in encounter timers like this, is what happens if you have something particularly dangerous coming up and you suddenly roll a 1. Or you have something you want to include in the scene, but then you roll a 4, and now it's so long that it doesn't actually come into play. So there are some ways to mitigate dice without fudging them per se and saying, I rolled a 4, I'm not super happy about it, I'm going to purposely change it. So mitigate rather than fudging. And a couple ways to do this for encounter timers is I really like the idea of a +1 or a -1 setting in the game. So for example, if I was rolling for mutant reptoids to show up, but I want them to kind of be really here, I'll say, okay, I'm going to roll a timer -1. So essentially they can't get a 4 with a minimum of 1. So I would roll a D4, 4 -1, it's going to be a 3. It kind of caps off the top so that it can induce some tension there. Or, for example, I know I don't want a 1. This Reptoid Gargantua is going to come in. They're going to slam into the window. I don't want it to be a 1 because I want there to be like a bit of a tension over 2 rounds or so. So instead, I'm going to add a +1 to whatever I roll. So I roll a 1 plus 1. It means there's a minimum of 2, and I can kind of mitigate the extreme ends of that dice, especially with a D4, without going overboard. The other way that I really like to mitigate timers in encounters is the idea of scalability, where depending on what's happening, especially a recurring timer that kind of happens over and over again. A good example of this in the Red Sword is the solar waves that's kind of passing from the dark star. It's happening almost every round. So it scales in the sense that if I roll a 4, well, you have a lot of time, and so to make up for that, the hit that the ship is going to take is going to be much bigger. So I've mitigated by saying you've had longer time, it's going to be a bigger hit. But if I roll something a little lower, unlike this 4, I flip the opposite and I go to a 1, well, that's not a lot of time, so I'm going to mitigate it and say it's scaled down, so we just had one big hit. The next hit that comes right after isn't as powerful because it spent most of its energy on the first one. And you can do this with anything. Scale it from 1 to 4. If it's a 1, tone it down. If it's a 4, tone it up. It's a great way of adjusting and challenge tuning on the fly. And so this is essentially encounter timers. Things that are happening in the scene using a D4 or a D6 because they're quick and dirty scenes a lot of the times, and then learning to add a +1 or -1 to kind of trim off some of the rough edges of those timers and mitigate it with some scalability. Now we're over here in the reactor engine room of the Red Sword, and this is where I want to kind of introduce the idea of these cross-scene timers. Now a cross-scene timer is a timer that persists from room to room versus an encounter timer, whereas like in that D4 with the Gargantua, if they left the room, the timer really wouldn't apply anymore. Well, a cross-scene timer is something that even if you leave the room or leave the encounter, it's still applicable. And for me, I really like to use, D4 is still good, but you can also tone these up to be something more along the lines of a D8 or even a D10, because depending on how many rooms they might have to go through or how long of the session it's kind of being a part of, you tone it up to a little bit higher of a die versus just a D4, so that you're not quite running, like I said, not putting everything pedal to the metal. You can tone things down with a little bit of a D8 or a D10. But anyways, in this room, what we're talking about is a cross-scene timer is after our players, while they're facing off with these reptoids who are facing, challenging them and trying to kill them in the engine room, they found out that they've got to stop the Dark Star, they've got to activate the engines, supercharge everything, and so they've come in and roll, come up to the engine, hit the levers, and the engines activate. Now, in the adventure itself, it rolls a D4. Now, in D4 rounds, you've got to run from one end of the thing to another. That can be pretty extreme because it's like 3 rooms, but with a D8 or a D10, it could give a little bit more, where they have to cross those scenes. Now, with a D8, I could roll, and it could be anywhere from a 1 to an 8. Still kind of a big swing. D10, same thing. Now, what this really does is it allows you to see how much time, how much distance. It includes that traveling time. But a way to mitigate some of the challenges there is I love for cross-scene timers to just set them. Like, there's nothing wrong with setting a dice rather than rolling a timer, setting a timer rather than rolling it. So, for example, knowing my players, knowing how we play, knowing how many rounds we go, like I can use my GM intuition and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to roll a 7. I'm not going to roll it. I'm going to set it. I'm going to say you guys have 7 rounds to get around. Now that is a long time, especially if you have really snappy players, but sometimes you don't have those snappy players. Sometimes it does take some time, and you don't want to be vicious with how much time you have left. Trust the dice, but you can also be compassionate and work with your players to best suit what the feel of the table is. Or even a D10. For example, rather than having a D10 be how much time they have to get from the engine room to the to the escape pods, use a D10 to describe, okay, after 10 rounds across multiple scenes, the reptoids are going to be very aware of your presence, and they're going to come out in force. So this can be a cross scene where now you're giving your players a challenge. In 10 rounds, things are going to get a lot harder. This is also a good way to talk about like exploration. You have 10 rounds to explore the ship before things start going really bad. So in the Red Sword, from the beginning to 10 rounds, that's how long they have to kind of figure out what's going on before things really hit the fan. Both really good ways to do it, and they were set timers rather than rolled timers, and I can use my GM intuition with my players to work with that. Additionally, you can have a tribunal and talk through with your players and be like, what do you guys think is fair? This 6 seems really vicious with knowing what's coming ahead. Do we want to talk about giving an extra 2 rounds, reducing it? Is it going too slow? A good opportunity to talk amongst players and set the timer that feels good for your table. Now, for this last type of timer, we're back here at the beginning of the Red Sword. Our players have just walked off their warp shell and entered through the airlock onto the derelict ship of the Red Sword. They don't know exactly what's going on, and as they start exploring around, looking through the lockers, they find this terminal and come over to kind of deck in, and they find a countdown for a few minutes away, maybe 30 minutes, an hour, however long the session is going to be. Now, this isn't included in the official Red Sword, but it's a great way of introducing a world timer into the scene. And a world timer is something that's talking about the world itself. It's a cross-session timer. It covers the whole thing. And a lot of the times it's describing or related to the overarching events or the climax of the story. It's very much tied into the story session itself. And it's a lot bigger. I love using D20s or D12s to describe my world timers. And I try to introduce them fairly early on the beginning, whether that's explicitly telling them this is what the world timer is, or it's kind of a mystery. Like in this particular case, they don't know exactly what's going to happen, but they'll slowly find out. And the reason why it's so good to have world timers at kind of this higher scale, whether it's a D12 or a D20, is because you want to be able to kind of use it throughout the whole thing. You want to have that pacing throughout. In most sessions, especially once you get familiar with your players, for me, I run sessions in 2 hours, and we get maybe 12 rounds, if not maybe 15 if we're really snappy. And so having those higher counts can really cover the whole session. But you want to be able to understand what it is and tune that down. So whether it's 20, 15 like in Orville's Tower, 12, I would probably end up doing something like a 12 round timer for here on Red Sword with some snappy players, and we'd call it a day. But anyways, the real benefit of these world timers is that there's always this kind of just impending tension as it ticks down. Something is happening on the grand scale. It's not necessarily affecting the scenes. It's not escalating things as time goes on. It could, but this is just it's leading to that climax. And so you can kind of know what's happening, and you can pace yourself a little bit. What I also love about world timers is it adds an element of dilemma to player choices. Every round counts. Every choice matters. And in a good adventure design, there's not enough time to do everything that the players want to do. They have to make choices. They have a dilemma so that their choices matter and it can impact the scene. If they have all the time in the world, it doesn't really matter. On Red Sword, if they had days and days and days to explore everything, they can always be prepared. They can find rest. Like that's the fun of the game, is knowing my time is limited and we have to make choices. And I love world timers for that. But whether we're kind of going along with those timers, again, following the cross-scene timers, which is a type of cross-scene timer, mitigating it would be setting it rather than rolling it. I wouldn't roll a world timer at the beginning like this. I would have a set 12 rounds, 15 rounds, 20 rounds, whatever I feel, and go from there. But what I would also do is, as the session is going on, a way to mitigate timers like this is allowing players to do timer damage. Just like target damage in ICRPG, you can do timer damage, whether that is doing something to increase the time or something happening in the game that decreases the amount of time. So let's think through this. For example, if we end up somewhere back in, say, the reactor room, and we've been playing along, and the world timer has dropped down to maybe 3 rounds left. They have 3 rounds left before things get bad. The red sword activates automatically, and they're like, oh no, we don't have, we're still working through time, we're still trying to do something, we need a little bit more time to figure out exactly what's going on. Maybe they can head into the engine room and they can hack in and stall it, or gum things up, or they can deactivate the autopilot in the control room or whatever, and they can buy back a certain number of rounds. That would be doing timer damage to increase their amount of time. Or perhaps they are back in the control the control deck, and they find out that the reptoids have torn into the controls. They walk in here, they see that everything's damaged, and now that timer of, say, they're at 12, 11, it goes down by 2 because something bad happened or whatever. You can damage the timer up or down, and that's a great way to help mitigate some timers that are either going for too long and there's not enough tension really to make them worthwhile, or they're going too quickly and they need to buy some more time, and now players can use their cleverness and their abilities and their choices to sacrifice their turns to help buy more time for their players and for their teammates. I just overall really like the timers and uses of world timers, crossing timers, and encounter timers, because overall they are a great way to control pacing, they are a great way to add dilemma, they are a great way to incorporate story beats and to plan as a GM. Like, you can use them to pace yourself and introduce story beats all along the way. It's not always about adding danger, it's about introducing beats to the story, so that you can control how much time is being spent where. You can introduce this tension, this anticipation. In this case of Red Sword, a lot of danger may be introduced, but in a town, you're using timers to control how much time they can spend in the town before everyone closes up shop, how much time they have left before they're done for the day. If they're at a party, how much time do they have to talk with people before the next phase of the party is introduced and everyone kind of attention is drawn away, or something else has happened. It's not always about putting the pedal to the metal, but timers are a great way and a great tool that no matter what type of game you're playing, they should and could benefit and help your game move along the way. But what do you think? How have you used timers in the past? What kind of timers do you really enjoy? What have been some of your favorite timers? Drop those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. But for now, let's head back to the kiln. Let's keep working on our projects, and we'll look forward to the next discussion. Hey, if you want to see more examples of timers, check out my recorded sessions. I use timers all over the place in a lot of different ways, so it may be a good place to get some inspiration or just to see how players react to them. So definitely worth a look.